Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We're going to get the webinar started. We have a terrific presentation today. I just want to mention that if anybody has questions during the presentation, please use the Ask a Question box in your lower left-hand corner. We will address all questions during our Q&A session at the end, but if time does permit during the presentation, we'll get to them as well. Thank you again for joining us. Today's webinar on future-ready data center and future-ready managed services is going to be a terrific webinar. The technology changes so fast and advances so frequently that it's important for everybody to keep up on what's happening now, but also to look to the future. We have two terrific presenters today. Steve Racing, who is the president and CEO of ASMGI. Steve has been running technology companies and managed services business for almost his entire career. ASMGI has a tremendous portfolio of customers, and they do managed services, security services, software development services, and have companies all over the world that they do business with, some of the very largest companies in the world. We also have Ken Maycloy, who's the Northeast Regional VP for Flex Central. Flex Central is one of the largest global data center providers in the world. Ken has been in the data center business and the co-location business for most of his career, and they're both going to touch on some of these topics that we mentioned and probably some others that you're interested in as well. So without further delay, please welcome Steve Racing, President and CEO of ASMGI. Steve?
Excellent. Thank you, Paul, for that very generous introduction. And I'm very excited about today's webinar and just very excited to have you with us, Ken, as well. And thank you to all the attendees for sharing your time with us today. I think it's probably worth noting that, man, this topic, there's a lot of material here, and we could go into a great deal of depth in any individual topic, and probably even do an entire webinar on a lot of the topics. But we're not going to do that today. But we will do future webinars on some of these topics. So please stay tuned for that, and by all means, let us know. Let us know if you're interested. And as Paul mentioned earlier, just feel free to ask questions at any time throughout the presentation, and certainly we'll do a Q&A at the end. So before I dig into the webinar topic, I just wanted to introduce ASMGI. For any of you that don't know who ASMGI is, we are a global technology services and consulting company focused on total solutions that really, drive an impact to your business. And so what do I mean by total solutions? And, this is one of those places where in order for us to consider something a total solution, it really encompasses people, process, and technology. And we see a lot of decision trees and points that, focus a lot on the technology itself, but we really want to make sure that we take the time to plan, manage, and execute, and that includes, having strong programs in place, but also an execution plan and an operating model and those kind of things. So how do we do it? Well, we do it through IT managed services and IT services and consulting, software, as Paul mentioned, software development, what we call software development, lifecycle services, and cyber and governance, risk, and compliance services. So rarely do I see in today's business climate, do I see a solution or a problem that needs to be solved that doesn't encompass some element of all three of those. So that from a tactical standpoint, I would say that we put a lot of emphasis on the front end of the process, like what is the program in place to help you manage through these things? And that would include infrastructure as well as governance, risk, and compliance, right? But do you have a cloud program, those types of things? So making sure that there's a strong program in place, not just to help you meet compliance requirements, but certainly that's a consideration, but also just to foster an environment of best practice across your entire enterprise. Best-in-class platforms and partners and tools. Flex Central is certainly one of those, as you'll see in the presentation today, but really leveraging best-in-class solutions or technology pieces of the solution to help be foundational and build around. Building an ecosystem to ensure that the tools work together, very important to us. So we really want to take the time to evaluate what you already have in place. Is it working for you? Is it not working for you? Those kind of things. And certainly that should enter the equation. But making sure when you do invest in tools and technology and co-location and those types of things, making sure that all the pieces, that they fit well together and they work well together. So most importantly, it's about achieving results. And we do that through a branded offering that we call One Team. And One Team is kind of a catch-all brand for us where we can a la carte pretty much our entire portfolio and just put the pieces together into like an everything as a service model and capabilities that ensure you're maximizing adoption and getting maximum value from your investments and those kind of things. We call this getting the benefits without the burden. And what that really means to us is that you should reap the benefits of all the modern technology and approaches to solving business problems that are available, but not take on a lot of the burden that often comes with that, right? So our approach it's a fill the gap approach. And what we mean by that is that, again, by taking the time to really evaluate what you currently do well and, areas that you need help in, we can fill those gaps where you need help, but certainly it's as much or as little as needed, right? So if there's an area that you're strong in or want to continue to deliver yourself, that's fine. And then lastly, I just want to mention, we have a little saying at ASMGI, action equals results, and I'm a firm believer in this. I always have been. There is no result without taking some action. So we're very action-oriented here. But I will say, in the current business climate and with a lot of the technology trends and various different things, we've evolved that a little bit to orchestrated action equals great results. And what I really mean by that is be very intentional about what actions you take and make sure that they tie back to your business objectives and the outcomes that you want, right? So take the time to define what outcome you're trying to achieve and then orchestrate all the pieces together to make that happen. And that's truly one of the trends in the industry. But anyway, that said, let's get started on the topic for today. I thought I'd start by just setting a little bit of context and talking through some of the decision points. It's complex when you're talking about data centers and really all the different point sources for generating, creating data and those types of things. It can get very complex very fast. And this is they call it the Gartner Cloud Shift model, but it does a really good job, I think, of mapping out, some of those key areas that you really have to evaluate and make sure that you're putting in the front end effort to understand how you're going to handle these. What's a day in the life? What are your operations going to look like going forward? So the blue, green, and red boxes, enterprise software, data center systems, and IT services. I mean, really today's discussion focuses on data center systems and IT services, but it's impossible to really talk about those without including enterprise software. But if you take a look at these boxes, you'll see that cloud, not cloud, public, private, all those decision points, they show up all over the place, and you really have to put a lot of energy into figuring out what's the right direction for your enterprise. There is no one size fits all. It truly is. It depends. It's different for every business. Everybody's got a different risk tolerance, different business drivers and value drivers and those kind of things. So the other point that I would make, I think, from this graphic specifically is that horizontal bar along the bottom. There's an orange square in there that says management and security. That is truly a piece of every element of your IT operations and should be looked at that way. Really, it's encompassed in all of those things. So moving on, I wanted to just touch on a couple of trends that are going on in the industry. I don't think any of these trends are probably going to be a surprise to any of you, but 2 years ago, actually, in 2017, there was a prediction, and it was based on a survey, but there was a prediction that in 2 years, more than half of the workloads would run in the cloud. And so the infographic that's here is kind of a current today. It was projections from 2017 and 2 years, which is ultimately now. But I won't go into a lot of detail on these things, but basically the gist is that things are moving to the cloud. There is no question, but I do think there's been a bit of a paring back, maybe a tightening of the reins, if you will, from a strategy of cloud first, and we'll touch on that a little bit, where a lot of CIOs, and maybe some of this was driven by the CEO, listening to NPR on the drive-in saying cloud's great and it's cheap and all these things, and we ought to go there. So, but cloud first was all about let's pick up everything and move it to the cloud. And I think enterprises are on board now saying maybe that's not realistic, and maybe it's not the right thing. Maybe part of it ought to be in the cloud, and part of it ought to be on premise, and part of it ought to be colo, and part of it ought to be hybrid or whatever on the edge. So we'll talk through some of these things. But I thought, again, in the spirit of setting context, it was neat to get the perspective from a couple years ago. And today, I think what I hear mostly in the industry is about, let's look forward even further, 5 years down the road, 6 years down the road. 80% of enterprises will have shut down their traditional data centers. And this is Gartner saying this. It's basically a prepare for the death of the data center as you know it prediction, right? And so it's interesting. And again, I don't think this is a surprise. Most people have probably heard all these things. But to me, it's less about the statistic itself than answering the question of why. Why is it relevant? And, why are we experiencing these things now? And so, maybe actually the question ought to be, why now? Why is this important and why is this relevant now? So I just wanted to throw a couple thoughts out because to me it really just breaks down into two things. One is strategic. It's focus your business on core competencies. And two is more tactical, right? There's a lot of we'll talk about some of the edge computing things, but there's a lot of data being generated at the edge and from devices at the device level and various different things like that. In fact, more data than it makes sense in a lot of cases to actually try to move across a network and those kind of things. So these are all driving those moves out of the traditional data center, which was on-premise or in-house if you're currently hosting your own data center. So if I take a look at number one, the strategic one, right? Focusing on your core competencies. This again is a Gartner thing, but I think it's a great piece to really solidify this mentality. It's a strategic alternative to a cloud-first mentality. So, and I think a lot of enterprises are really paring back. In fact, most people that talk about digital transformation, there was actually a term, cloud-first digital transformation, and I think it was a hype-driven phrase or term actually. And again, I think a lot of enterprises are really pared back on that and still talk about digital transformation, and rightfully so. But truly looking at co-location, right? So if your data center is not a core competency, if it isn't a core piece of your business, for example, if you're a healthcare company, your strategic business focus should really be on patient care, not on heating and cooling, right? So infrastructure operations, leaders planning for the future of infrastructure delivery should really look at taking their legacy workloads and get them out of their own data centers, right? You don't want to be responsible for, capital expenditures every several years and refreshing HVAC units and calculating how much cooling you need and power and all those various different other things. Again, if you're a healthcare company, focus your resources on figuring out how to deliver better patient care and get better outcomes. And this premise really applies to all industries, not just healthcare, certainly. But when I look at co-location, I see three main advantages, really: cost, compliance, and control. And these are showing up all over the place for enterprises as well, particularly with some reduced headcounts maybe, or lack of capacity or expertise and those kind of things. But from a cost standpoint, when you evaluate on-premise versus co-location in the cost model, it's not just it isn't an apples to apples thing, right? But there's to make it apples to apples, you have to look at not just capital expenditure versus OpEx, but you have to look at what does it really take to operate our data center internally. And even on the capital expenditure side, a lot of times what we're seeing is that you just can't meet the economics of a colo model without depreciating the assets and various different things. You still have to refresh them and also so it's a win for co-location when you look at costs, and certainly compliance. And we could talk forever just on this one topic, but shared responsibility with subservice providers or data center providers, leveraging, if you need to be SOX compliant or anything like that, doing a carve-out model and just really leveraging a SOC report from a data center provider is a huge help, I think, in offloading some of those controls. But it is still your responsibility to protect your data, right? So anyway, shared responsibility there, but offload a lot of that compliance to your service provider and control. So it's when you're in a colo environment, you still have a semblance of control over your infrastructure, really to whatever extent you want. When you're in a public cloud environment, you give up a lot of that. So those, I think, are relatively standard, but worth noting and important. So when I look at number 2, again, it's a little more tactical, moving compute closer to the data. It's a huge trend, and part of it is driven by all of the things that are going on in the technology space around IoT, 5G. Everything is making it easier and creating more data at the device level, at the mobile level, and various different things. And if I really drilled into, Gartner's got a top 10 strategic technology trends. All of these are relevant, but if you look in the digital column, the top 2, digital twins and edge computing, these are 2 things I want to touch on, but when you think about moving compute closer to the data, it's really to combat the problem of latency and getting all that data back to a central data lake. I mean, maybe it just doesn't make sense to do that anymore. Cisco's got a study that says 99% of the things in the physical world are still not connected to the internet, right? So there's a lot more data to be generated and created, and a lot of businesses are still trying to figure out the use cases in order to do that. I just wanted to do a couple of examples real quick on the data piece of this, but in an edge computing world, and specifically the digital twin, traditional model you see on the right, it's a compressor model. You're measuring data, but you capture all the unstructured data, you send it to a logger, then you send all the structured data up to a central repository or a database, and then you perform analytics on it, right? So the more data, the more time it takes to process various different things, but lots and lots of data. So how much data? Well, it just in a single compressor example, 70 samples per a single revolution, 1,000 revolutions per minute. Do that for 24 hours a day for 365 days a year. It's more than 1,000 petabytes of data a year, right? So if you're a typical manufacturing company, you have more than one compressor, but you can see that it equates to a lot of data very quickly. RFID, another common use case for digital twins, but you have RFID in an assembly line configuration, you have RFID sensors all over the place. 2,000 readers in this specific case, right? So about 10,000 reads a second. Hundreds of thousands of tagged assets move through that assembly line, and each asset gets seen by multiple readers and all these things. Huge, huge database. So as you can see, from an edge computing standpoint perspective, when you look at some of the digital technologies out there, there's a lot of data being created. So the other thing I wanted to just touch on real quick, and I won't spend a lot of time on this today, but hybrid IT is a great model. And if you're already in the cloud, for example, like you're using Azure, a lot of hybrid IT models, you don't have to learn new tools and various different things. Azure has an Azure Stack. It's a collaboration between Microsoft and some tier 1 providers that they have, like Dell, for example. But the operating environment and the way that you develop and the way that you deploy and do all those things is very similar across the board. So how do you actually prepare for the future? Plan, manage, and execute is a saying that we use at ASMGI, and I just wanted to touch on a couple of things real quick on that. So planning, how do you figure out what is the optimal mix of cloud, colo, edge, and on-premise? It has to be an effort, and you really have to evaluate how you're doing what you do, and how you move data. Data flow is critical in those kind of things. Relocation services. How do you pick up what you have and move it to a colo even? So all these things need to be looked at from a planning perspective. And you need to start these exercises way before you're ready to pull the trigger. But then how do you execute? Use professional help on executing a data center relocation, because there are a lot of, I'll say a lot of idiosyncrasies and things that can show up along the way, both on the planning and the execution side. But operations, data center as a service, NOC/SOC as a service, and DR as a service are just a couple of examples. Security and compliance as a service could be mentioned here as well. But these are all things that are critical in your operating model to think about as you're looking to future ready yourself for all of these trends in technology and those kind of things. So having said all that, and again, I apologize for moving through things really quickly, and hopefully please ask questions if you have them, but we can drill into any one of these areas in more detail from a question standpoint. But having said that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken, and Ken from Flexential is going to talk a little more about trends and a little more about how the data center world is really addressing those.
Steve, thank you very much, and I appreciate it. Great topic, and certainly I appreciate all your help. You and ASMGI are a great partner for Flexential. Your management and your security capabilities are critical to a lot of our deliveries. So just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the edge to the core, and really talk about those edge centers that are critical for that delivery. And wanted to highlight a few of the pictures of that are on this first page, and I'll come back to this later in the deck. But these are just a few of our data centers, which we call Generation 4 data centers, and are really our edge centers, and really where the business is evolving to. Las Vegas is one of those pictures. Denver is one of those pictures. Plano, Texas, and Philadelphia are just a handful of our 41 data centers that are part of our footprint. So just wanted to highlight a few of those pictures as to where the data center is evolving to, and really how these edge centers are becoming critical for delivery. Just 5 things that I think you need to know. Edge enables digital transformation. Every company is evolving along this path today, whether they know it or not, and really their applications have to be defined to meet the ability to address the edge and address their customers where they live. Latency kills, as Steve noted, right? Actionable data needs to be closer to the user to actually be usable. Develop the edge and the distributed strategies now. You need to plan for the inevitable future, and getting in front of this now versus later is key for remaining competitive in this marketplace. And then improving the connectivity from the edge to the core, and improving the capacity from the edge to the core. And we'll touch on all of these here briefly, but you really have to get comfortable with your providers and make sure that your providers are capable of delivering on the connectivity and the capacity, because they're both critical as you start to deliver applications closer to the edge. I know this is a busy slide. There's a lot of information on this slide, but really the 2 key things to focus on are the 2.3 zettabytes that are in storage by 2020, and 600 zettabytes of data delivered over transport by 2020. Just an astronomical amount of data that's going across the wire and across these services, and the amount of data that's accumulating. It's just incredible, the exponential demand that has increased the data, and there's no stopping of it. There's no stopping of it. It's in sight. It's just going to continue to grow and grow as we continue to evolve. Really wanted to spend a little bit of time just really defining what the infrastructure is, and where these near edge data centers and these edge data centers are, and the criticality of them, right? So defining the infrastructure, at the top layer, it's the core, right? It's the hyperscalers, it's the cloud data centers, it's the co-location centers, it's the enterprise on-prem centers. It's really far away from the consumer and where the consumer is accessing data, right? So these are high latency data centers. It's where long-term data analysis lives, and it's really where the enterprise applications live. If you move down the stack, it's those near edge data centers that are becoming key to the delivery of capabilities as the Internet of Things continues to evolve. Those near edge data centers are really in the tier 2 cities, and it's for those mid-sized deployments, and it's really an acceptable latency. It's the low latency, it's the medium latency requirements. It's that 30 to 50 millisecond latency of getting information to and from the end user. And then you go down the stack further, and it's really the edge that we're talking about today, and how we're evolving, right? And what's coming about with the technology advances of today. It's the smart cities, it's the smart business, it's the smart industries, right? It's where information is being delivered. For example, the autonomous cars are appearing everywhere now, right? And if you look at just a specific application of an autonomous car, right, in San Jose, but the information is being collected and disseminated in a Denver data center. That's a 50 millisecond latency, right? And 50 milliseconds and the decision process, it's potentially a disaster in that environment. So we really have to start thinking about where the information needs to be and where the application needs to be to address these applications and to get the information closer to the decision maker and to make sure that it's available. As you step through this, and I said earlier, one of the key points is that edge enables the digital transformation, right? When you look at IoT and AI, they're beginning to deliver across all of the industries. Agriculture, finance is a big driver of AI and blockchain applications. Smart cities are starting to evolve very rapidly. California, for instance, 60%, there's use cases now where they're delivering 60% less water with the monitoring capability that they can put into these smart cities. And California is a big driver of that. The fisheries there, right? By monitoring the fisheries, they can really conserve water and produce in a much more efficient rate. When you look to like the mining industry in Australia, for example, it was already deploying the Internet of Things with autonomous mining equipment and trucking equipment. You just go down across every industry. Everyone is evolving rapidly with all of this content that needs to be delivered out to the edge, and it's critical that we, as providers and consumers of it, and the operations people deliver on this capability. Just stepping through it a little bit faster, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, right? I mean, it's intelligent AI, and it's the learning machines that will drive traffic back into the network at incredible data rates, right? And so we just look at how the data is evolving over time. Today, 34 billion devices, hundreds of billions of packets transferring, going back and forth, evolving to 50 billion devices by 2020. Trillions of packets, right? I mean, you look at where Netflix was in 2007 and let's say 2009. Really, they evolved when they were able to compress data and deliver it as streaming media. Now you move to today. Game of Thrones is coming on Sunday. How many of those devices, those streaming devices, will be watching Game of Thrones on Sunday night? It's just amazing how the industry has evolved. And really, when we talk about it, it's really the core and the near edge transport that really can't support all of this data that's moving back and forth, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. Just really defining data services as they continue to explode, and the traffic patterns as they continue to change. Where are we today, right? At the core, it's the storage, it's the cloud, it's big data analytics. Tomorrow, the core is really going to handle the storage, the cloud, big data, and it's going to do the deep analytics, the big data information, and the processing of that big data. The near edge is really where it sits today. It's the distribution and the delivery of a lot of that core infrastructure and core applications. Where is it going to evolve to? It's going to evolve to analytics. The edge cloud. The cloud is going to move closer and closer to the edge. It's the compute. It's the data collection. It's the fog computing. It's all of those things are starting to move to these edge data centers. And really today, the far edge is really the consumption and the connectivity of that information. It's those smart devices that are out there. But where is it going, right? The edge is really it has to evolve to micro cloud, AI. The decisions need to be made at that far edge as it becomes more and more important to deliver these services. You talk about cloud in the boxes evolving, right? I mean, these 2U boxes that are extremely dense, store petabytes of information. The applications are moving to the edge, and we have to be able to deliver across the edge. Again, Steve touched on this, right? Latency kills, right? And it's all those applications across all those different industries. It's the healthcare, it's AI, it's safety, right? With the autonomous cars, healthcare, it's those health monitors. You need to have those decisions made very, very rapidly. In the retail business, it's security, right? I mean, it's security monitoring. You have to make a decision very, very quickly if you understand that there's, or if you recognize that there's a security breach. The decisions are being made on the edge. It's those smart devices that are making those decisions. So when you look at the core, it's the analytics, it's the big data. In the near edge, it's that regional compute, right? And today, it's really 95, like 100% of the data is going back into the regional compute. 95% of that data is relatively useless to the end user, right? It's the monitoring, it's the management information that's going back. It's really only 5% of that data that's traveling in between those computes back and forth. It's really that 5% of that data is actionable. And that's really the data that has to remain at the far edge and the near edge in order to make decisions. And really, it's that actionable data that really needs to be actioned at a very small amount of time, right? Within that 2 to 5 millisecond range in order for it to be effective and useful. Just going through this again, data, again, needs to be processed closer to the user. Unlike centralized data centers, edge data centers push processing physically closer to the source. People no longer really are patient, right? I mean, it's amazing. Gartner did a study in 2010. People had 3 seconds of patience, and we go to today, and people only have 2 seconds of patience. So it's amazing how people are becoming more and more impatient and really need their data quicker. I'm certainly guilty of that. But the data needs to get processed closer to the user, and we as providers are constantly trying to evolve to meet that need. Again, the near edge data centers are really the hub for these far edge deployments. So really, how the data centers are evolving, where all the applications and the resources used to exist at the core. Now, a lot of these applications have moved to the near edge through these near edge data centers because they're getting closer and closer to the customer, right? So it's these tier 2 cities that these large data centers are being deployed, and it's really mid-sized deployments, right? The back end and the core still exists with the core, but it's those mid-sized deployments that are moving the applications that are key for the end user. We're moving those applications closer and closer to the user, and that's where these near-edge data centers are becoming key. So what do these edge data centers look like? They're very dense compute capability. They have the capability of having incredible power per square footage capability, and there's incredibly dense carrier interconnection. So there's a lot of carriers that are coming into these facilities, so you can move this the transport of data in and out very, very efficiently. So really, what is the call to action, right? For us as developers of applications to meet consumer needs, it's really to develop your edge and distributed strategies now. It's critical that we get on the front end of this and we start to develop service offerings that support these edge deployments. And we also need to utilize more near-edge data center deployments to manage that data, those applications, and the traffic that's coming in and out of those applications. And it's key to really analyze and improve on the connectivity and the capacity from the edge to the core. You have to be able to plan to tether to the far edge. The data is not magically going to appear from the far edge all the way back to the core, all the way back to the hyperscalers. You really have to sit down and strategically develop what your connection strategy is and what your capacity strategy to get from the hyperscalers all the way out to the edge and all the way out to the end users. And really, it's key. I mean, to deploy more services to the edge, we have to deliver it in a very short amount of time, right? So we're partnering with a lot of customers, including ASMGI, Edge Micro, NVIDIA, Akamai, Vapor.io. They're all working with our edge centers now to start to deliver all of that capability closer and closer to the customer. So again, interconnection is key. make the decision as to what is managed at the edge and what should be delivered at the core. Drop and dump those non-critical data to the edge. Again, 95% of the data that's transferring across back and forth from the core all the way to the edge is really considered non-critical data. Understand what that data is and move it back to the core and deal with it there. It's really that 5% of the data that is actionable, identifying what that data is and where that data needs to live across your entire spectrum of where your data resides. It's key to identify what that actionable data is. Take action for that critical data. Utilize fog to do that. Deliver to the core only the data that needs deep analytics, the long-term storage and the high security, really. I mean, it's all that 95% of that data that needs to live there as opposed to being on the edge. So where are we? Flexential has really developed a core of data centers, a data center footprint that spans across 41 data centers nationally in the U.S., and we've tied together a network backbone that ties all 41 of those data centers together, and it's a 100 gig backbone, and all those data centers have low latency connectivity back to the core, back to the hyperscalers, back to the on-prem enterprises, and it's really those 41 data centers that span across the U.S. that deliver all of this capability. And what we've defined as Flex Anywhere is really utilizing that backbone, that 100 gig backbone that can expand to 400 gig, and really it's a software-defined network backbone, and we have the ability to deliver services for the customers in a very, very efficient manner. This gives you a map of what our footprint looks like, right? So the backbone itself, how it stretches into Europe, how it stretches into the Asia Pac with undersea cable, and really it's a network of connectivity that involves 41 cloud and co-location centers, and it extends into all of the key network pops throughout the country, and really we define those data centers as edge centers. So, Steve, with that, I would offer to the participants here that two of our key executives, Tim Parker, who manages our entire network, and Jason Caroline, who is our chief innovation officer, they developed a guide, a book on hybrid edge computing. I certainly make that available to everyone. So I'm going to take a pause there. I'm going to throw it back to Steve, and maybe we open it up for some questions.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thanks, Ken, for that. And please, everybody in the audience, take advantage of the opportunity to get your hands on that book. I had a couple thoughts before I move into questions. Ken, one thing, you're talking about trillions of packets and all these things being sent over the internet. Just one thing that popped into my head is actually the 50th anniversary this year of the internet. So the internet was invented, if you will, on October 29th in 1969 by a guy named Len Kleinrock. So he's the mathematical genius, right, who put the whole mathematical model of packets together. And actually, his team, it wasn't him who pushed the button, but his team sent the first packet from UCLA to Stanford University at 10 p.m. on, October 29th, 1969. When I think about where we're at today, I ask myself, I wonder what Len Kleinrock would think, right?
Yeah.
Trillions of packets. They tried to send the word login, right? That was the first packet to be sent. It was pre-ARPANET, right? So it was it was switch to switch, but it was before there were 4 universities connected, and it failed after the O, right? So the first actual transmission over the internet was the letters LO, and then they crashed and they got back up, and you talk about latency, right? I wonder how long it took to get there, but anyway, it's really
50 years from now, where will we be, huh? It's amazing.
Where will we be? It's amazing to think about. But you said a couple other things, Ken, that I think are really interesting, and that's just from a consumer standpoint, the lack of patience, from 3 seconds down, to a second. Well, a couple things popped into my mind there. One was not if you're a teenager, right? It's way less than a second. But the key is it's not magic, right? All this data is being created from the edge, and you're watching movies or listening to music on your phone, but it isn't magic, right? It has to come from a data center and get to you, and you have to be. You mentioned just being real intentional and deliberate about designing an architecture that works for your specific business case or use case. I think that's a key point because, we all get maybe a little bit like a feeling of the magic aspect of it, right? Like I'm going to turn on my computer and my email is going to start flowing in. Like it's magic. It's not magic, right? The cloud, the cloud's a data center, right? But I think that's a key point, and I appreciate you, saying it that way because it just isn't magic, right? It really does require an intentional design, and the trends that we talked about, like edge computing and things like that, these are real. These are real things, and they're happening, and we're, as individuals, we're not going to stop this movement, right? This transformation, this digital transformation of business. So it really does become about being very intentional and architecting the future that you want for your business. And lastly, I just wanted to make the point, I remember a day when moving to a data center was really about the power, having a generator or redundant generators, right? Having AB feeds, having a power redundancy. It was really about uptime. It was about power. But today, what really I think stood out from your presentation, and I think is a point worth making, it's still about that, but connectivity, like having a network in place is critical, right? I think we've moved as a market. We've moved to an optimized phase, right? Data centers, and particularly in this edge paradigm that we're talking about, data centers can be used to optimize your architecture, your overarching enterprise, architecture, and that really stood out. So I appreciate those things, and it looks like we got some. Go ahead.
It's interesting, real fast, just to say how fast we're evolving, right? I mean, the hyperscalers, they sit in these large data centers. What's really happening right now in our business is those hyperscalers are reaching out to these tier 2 cities and these edge data centers, and they're building their deployments in these edge centers. So to move these hyperscalers and this public cloud closer and closer to the customer. So it's amazing how even the hyperscalers are starting to evolve to make sure that their capabilities are closer to where their customers need to be.
Yep. Very, very good point. Let me get some attendee questions queued up here, Ken, and I'm going to serve a couple of these up to you, and please share your thoughts on those. The first one is what should I consider when I'm trying to determine between cloud computing versus edge computing?
For me, I think it's critical for again, going back to that actionable data, right? I mean, it's really understanding where the data that is critical to get to your end users and developing those applications specifically to delivering that content to the edge, right? So it's identifying the data and the majority of that data really can be moved back into the core, back into the hyperscalers, back into the on-prem applications. But it's really defining the actionable data and the applications that need to deliver on that actionable data. And then it's those applications that really should sit on the edge. So I talk about the data centers that exist. It's those mid-sized deployments, right? All the core analytics and analysis goes back to the core, and it's really those applications that sit in those edge data centers. So where we're seeing evolve, right, in the large enterprise, the large enterprise is going through the process of defining their applications, and the applications that they need to deliver data closer to their customers, they're deploying in those edge centers. So we're seeing those mid-tier, those mid-sized deployments, those 5 to 10 cabinet cages for the large enterprises that are showing up in our data centers, and those large enterprises are keeping all that core information either on-prem or sitting in the hyperscaler. So they're not moving a lot of data in and out of the hyperscalers because the egress is just too complex and too expensive. They're identifying the data where it needs to be. They're moving that data and those applications to those edge data centers, and that's where they're being delivered. So it's really identifying the data and where that data needs to be delivered and acted on.
Yeah. Yep, and just a quick reflection on that. I mean, user experience is obviously important to every business, just for that patience factor alone, right? If you're dishing out streaming anything and you're not performing, the end users are going to use and go to a different app. But I also wanted to point out, I think, historically the big data model, we don't hear people talking about big data a lot. It's more about advanced analytics and AI and machine learning now. But the older big data model was central, data lake, right? A central repository, which was a core somewhere, or the public cloud. And that was a paradigm, I think, that started to gain some traction until people recognized the cost of doing that, right? So I wanted to throw cost in there because it can be a huge factor. If you've got just literally millions of data points and you have to get all that data back to a central data lake in the cloud before you can even do analytics, and then you have to perform analytics on such a large volume of data. It can take a tremendous amount of computing power and a tremendous amount of time. And I think that model is shifting, and this was one of the other drivers. And IoT is really responsible, I think, for driving a lot of this. But digital twins and a lot of the edge technologies, intelligent edge technologies, I'll say, sometimes are about processing, doing analytics on the fly, right? Inline analytics, so you can process data as it's generated directly from the device. These are things that we're working on now with some partners from the West Coast, U.S.-based Silicon Valley area that have some really cool analytics models that are, digital twin based, right? So we can process data on the fly, and then only, to your point, you only send the stuff back to, the data lake that's relevant. So you have an opportunity to pre-process your data at the edge. So the economics is a huge driver for that as well, I think. Let's get to another question. What computing should I consider at the edge?
Again, it's evolving rapidly, right? So we're working very closely with a lot of the providers now. Edge Micro, NVIDIA, which is they've developed a high-end processing GPU, and their devices are starting to sit out on the edge because they're doing more and more processing on the edge, right? So we're working with Akamai, we're working with Vapor.io. What we're starting to see evolve is more and more compute and decision making is being made on the edge. Again, going back to the data that's relevant, right? The more that they can process on the edge as opposed to back on the core, the more information they can process and decision making that can be made is really ending up on the edge, and it's the compute and the processing, the compute capability that's really defining that, right? So as the box providers are getting more and more sophisticated, the GPUs are processing data in a far more efficient manner. A lot of those boxes are starting to show up in these edge centers.
Yep. Yeah, and I might just add that how you do compute at the edge is evolving tremendously fast as well, right? So there are all these different, and again, we could do an entire webinar probably on any one of these even, but hybrid IT in general, there's hyper-converged infrastructure, there's Azure Stack. If you're using Azure in the public cloud, you can sit it right next to your own infrastructure in your colo data center and those kind of things. But containers, we're working with a lot of clients that are leveraging containers, right? So they can basically run anywhere. and do compute. Some of the intelligent edge stuff we're doing, we just need to find CPU cycles somewhere. So we're deploying a core platform piece of technology right on the PLC in some cases, right on their processor, leveraging it, or on a desktop on the plant floor and those kind of things. But to your point, any compute that I think it's whatever makes the best sense, right? It's if you don't have to send the data back, and again, 90% of the data generated from these edge devices is probably not stuff that you really need to do analytics on at headquarters. So a lot of technology going on. It's a great question, and we could probably spend a lot of time just on that. Here's a question. So we've got operations in APAC. I think you mentioned that, Ken, in one of your slides earlier. So the question goes, we have operations in APAC, sometimes experience latency from the U.S. Is there anything you can think of that would help us, with that problem?
Yeah, Steve, what I did was I pulled back up that slide, right? So again, it shows the network connectivity of all our data centers and our POPs. Again, it's that 100 gig backbone that we've built that connects all of our data centers, and we've architected really to meet the future, right? We've architected it to scale to 400 gig, right? So as all of this information is moving back and forth from the edge back to the core, it also needs to move. It also needs to move internationally, right? And our Portland data center is actually the drop-off point for the low latency undersea cable that extends into the Asia Pac, into Australia, into the Hawaiian Islands, right? So a lot of that connectivity and a lot of those deployments come through that subsea cable that connects in our Portland data center. So the hyperscaler, again, going back to the hyperscalers that are starting to deliver their services is in these edge centers. It's amazing, the hyperscalers, as they need to get closer and closer to their customers and the Asia Pac specifically. A lot of them sit in that Portland data center to access that subsea cable and that low latency out into the Asia Pac, Australia, and beyond. So it's one of the key features of our network. None of our competitive peers have that kind of capability, and it's amazing how the enterprise has taken advantage of that.
Yep. Just a quick add-on question to that, Ken. So would it be your recommendation that somebody would consider then the Oregon data center as an edge site to their APAC operations and put infrastructure there, or can they be in any one of your 41 data centers and still see a performance boost?
Oh, and again, it goes back to how these applications are developed. But Steve, absolutely, right? A lot of customers utilize that data center as a POP, right? So they keep the compute that's required to access that low latency undersea cable. They keep that kind of compute in that Portland data center, but the connectivity that goes back to our other data centers is where they're keeping their core applications, right? So through the process, they've architected the solution. They strategically looked at their applications, what data is critical to be on that edge, and really what data needs to get moved into Asia Pac very, very quickly in a low latency fashion, and they moved those applications into those data centers. So again, I was talking like you see a lot of mid-tier, mid-size deployments. Those are the deployments that are going into those edge centers, and specifically Portland, to access the Asia Pac. So it's really how you architect your applications and what data is deemed critical to move across the Asia Pac in a low latency format.
Yep, awesome. What about security and compliance? I just looked at the time, so I'm going to move pretty quickly through a few more questions. We got a bunch of them in here. What about security and compliance? If we operate in a hybrid model, some things in the cloud, some in colo, some at the edge, and even in our on-premise data center, how do we ensure all environments have the same controls in place?
A lot of times we defer to you on that, Steve, right? You as our partner, we defer to you on the security and the compliance side.
Yep. So let me just reflect on that real fast. We have some partners in our portfolio, which again is very strategic for us, but really focus on cloud security and multi-platform security. So whether it's multi-cloud or hybrid IT environments anywhere, we can create a single pane of glass view But we also do what we call compliance templates. So we can ensure, again, through the use of tools and people, process, and technology, actually, that compliance guidelines are adhered to across all the environments in a similar fashion, and we can actually throw flags and alerts when they aren't, and various different things like that. So I think we're going to do an actual webinar specifically on cloud-based security and hybrid IT security and compliance specifically. So we'll make sure that we broadcast that information out. Here's one. This is about our partnership. What is the ASMGI partnership, Ken? Is ASMGI a services subcontractor?
Yeah, well, we use ASMGI for multiple things, right, Steve? You've been a great partner for us on multiple things, really, the management and the monitoring and the security and the compliance. There's a multitude of capabilities that we continue to evolve and you deliver for us.
Yeah, well, thank you for those kind words, Ken. I will highlight also that, we're very focused on best-in-class partners, technology partners, and I would consider certainly Flexential to be one of those. That it's when you walk through a Flexential data center, everything is in place, and it's just amazing that the care and feeding that takes place at your data centers and the infrastructure. But from today's presentation, I'm so ultimately impressed with your network and how all the pieces work together. So again, it's an ecosystem thing for us. How do all the pieces play together? And we really, really can leverage a partnership with Flexential to meet the needs of businesses. And so that's what it's about for us. And I appreciate that. Many of my
Steve,
customers
I would extend that where what Flexential is very good at is delivering on the blocking and tackling, right? The core infrastructure. It's the network. It's the resiliency of that network. It's the data centers. It's the resiliency of that data center. And then we look to partners like you to solidify that with your capabilities.
Yeah, great, good point. And I think one way to frame it up is that we go higher up the stack, right? So you handle all the foundational stuff, and we'll go higher up the stack. I want to try to get another question in real quick. I recognize it's 2:00, so but I want to try to get everybody's questions answered. Many of my customers are hospitals. What industries do you see moving to the edge data centers?
Yeah, absolutely. The hospitals are absolutely one of those that are moving to the data center, to the edge, for a couple of reasons, right? I mean, a lot of the information that they deliver now needs to be real time, right? And sit in a regional data center. Epic is one of the big applications that most major hospitals use, and latency of that application itself is very, very critical. So the hospitals and healthcare are a very key vertical for these edge centers. And what the edge centers provide is security and resiliency, right? I mean, it's the data centers, and it's especially Flexential. We pride ourselves on resiliency and that security aspect. Both of those things are critical for HIPAA customers, such as hospitals, but even more importantly, the data has to be up and running and always available, and those key data centers play an important part for healthcare providers. So absolutely key vertical for us and these edge centers that continue to evolve. Yep,
Roger that. And for me, I think it really is across all industries. In manufacturing, it's IoT and operational technology. In retail, it's IoT devices and data at the edge. It just really you could go on and on, but it really does permeate all industries from an edge computing standpoint. I know we're out of time. I just wanted to sneak in one last question. How does edge computing help when you still need to get your data to a central data lake I touched on this a little bit, so did you, Ken. Just real quick, I would say, first of all, the first thing you would do is ask yourself the question, do you really need all the data back in the central data lake, right? So make sure you're being strategic about your data flow and what data you actually need. And then look at the cost of different types of connectivity and those kind of things. And maybe leveraging some more advanced technologies like digital twins or intelligent edge stuff to do some of that pre-processing so you only send back what you need. We are out of time, and I apologize if I didn't get to your question, but I do want to be respectful that it's a little bit after 2. I wanted to mention real quick, we have a couple events coming up. Actually, next week, next Wednesday, we're going to be at Flexential's data center in Collegeville, PA. It's right outside of Philadelphia. So if you happen to be in that area, please sign up and come see us. We'll be there. I'll be there, actually. Ken will be there as well. And then also later the following month, I think May 9th, actually, Flexential has a huge block party. There'll be a lot of existing customers there and some new prospects and various different things. But again, a good opportunity to connect and talk through many of these various different things. And with that, I think that we'll wrap up. Thank you, Ken, and thank you for your partnership and your participation in the webinar today. And I really appreciate you being here and sharing your wisdom in the area and certainly on the topics. And with that, I think we'll say goodbye.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for attending. Bye-bye.